So, welcome. In this video, we're going to explore the key actors and processes that drive state and local government outside of official elected offices. When we look at who holds political power in an election cycle or a policy debate, power generally shifts between three major forces: the candidates, based on the charismatic nature of the individuals who capture the public spotlight, they tend to be the number one. But then there's also political parties, the traditional organization, the backbone of the American elections, and then interest groups, which are rapidly growing as the dominant influence in modern policy. So let's look at how political parties and interest groups operate before we examine how they influence the actual policy making cycle. Political parties recruit candidates, link citizens to government services, build shared platforms. However, the party structure in the US has two unique features that you do want to understand. One, it's a bottom up organization and their state control. So, party regulations and election rules are set at the state level, not the national level, even for national elections. States set polling hours, primary rules, and ballot requirements. Because our primary system is encoded directly into state laws, our two party system is deeply entrenched within that system, which is why you have a hard time seeing the political parties change over 150 years. We've had the same two political parties. It's because they're coded into state laws and often into state constitutions. So when we look at what do parties do, I think the one of the best examples is kind of looking at the national kind of party level. Is what they do is they recruit candidates, they help candidates with the how tos, they coordinate elected officials, and then they establish relatively shared political agenda. So, and one of the ways that you see this is in 1988, Bill Clinton was asked to give the keynote address at the presidential nomination convention, and then he became the nominee in 1992 for the Democratic Party. Similarly, Barack Obama was asked to give the keynote address at the 2004 presidential nomination convention, and then became the candidate in 2008. So, two prime examples from the Democratic Party of how, again, the parties help to kind of build up, put candidates into the spotlight for national attention. All right, and then they really are the link of citizens to government. So, not only during elections, but they help to provide access to government services, they mobilize voters, and they raise money. So, political parties are just a key backbone of what's happening, often behind the scenes, unless you're officially involved in one of those aspects of the political, what's going on in the political elections, and again, even in between elections. All right, I think it's just a good thing just to kind of know, why do we only have two parties besides the fact that they are encoded in our state's constitutions and state laws. But one of the couple other reasons why we have the two party system is because of the National Electoral College. So again, that's coded into the US Constitution, and our sort of winner takes all across most elections. You will see some of that change at some of the state and local levels, but for the most part, across the majority of elections, it's usually a winner takes all. So again, two parties seem to make the most sense in that regard. Again, especially we look at the national level, because two parties exist at the national level, you don't see as many new parties coming up at the state or local level. Although you do have, again, state and local elections where winner takes all doesn't always happen or doesn't always take place. But it's because of our national view of the electoral college and winner takes all that we've pretty much have ended up with two political parties. All right, not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but just kind of, I think it's kind of fun to mention. So, if a third party does form, it usually in the United States, it usually forms around one issue. So, yeah, if you're interested, kind of take a look. I've thrown a few on here. So the one underneath there on that big one on the side really is the Pirate Party. So you can go out and take a look and see what that is. But for the most part, third parties form around one issue. If that issue does well, then the Democratic or Republican Party will then kind of absorb, usually tends to absorb that policy or that idea into their platform. Sometimes both parties will do it as well, depending on the topic. But usually it gets pulled into one party or the other, and then that third party sort of again loses its steam and it kind of goes away. All right, so it's just like to highlight that, political parties versus ideology. A party label is really only a rough approximation, especially when you only have two large political parties that represent a very um, disparate population, as kind of mentioned in the first video of the semester. So, again, regional political culture really creates huge variations between a Republican and Democrat. In Illinois, often looks quite different than one from Southern Illinois. So, again, Democratic Party tends to dominate in Northern Illinois, and historically in Southern Illinois, that's shifted a little bit. But again, what those two candidates look like are actually very different. All right, so another thing you just kind of like to highlight is the history of political parties. Again, talking about the de-alignment versus the realignment and how they shifted over time. And if you're interested in this, there is a link in the slide. But you really did see a big shift between 1896 versus what you see today. And again, here's the two maps kind of showing you states that we consider pretty traditionally Democratic today were Republican in 1896, and vice versa. So again, we have seen a very big shift um, as sort of like again a de-alignment, realignment over kind of following the Civil War, and then also during the early part of the 1900s. All right, just a quick note that even if even if there was only one party, the way our political party system works, it would still be a bit chaotic because when we talk about political parties, there's kind of three different levels to this. There's the electorate, the elected officials, and then there's the party organization. And each one views the party in a different way. The political party, what the nature of it is, and how they use it. The electorate, obviously, kind of maybe uses it to help gauge who they're going to vote for as a general rule. The elected officials, again, because they run under that party label, again, they may be closely linked to it. They may not have a strong affiliation with the party. And then the party organization and those involved with the party organization obviously are going to care the most about really kind of making sure the party is doing well and kind of keeping the party going, again, as opposed to elected officials who may care about their own personal policy and their own personal agenda more. So again, we won't get much into this, but I just kind of usually like mentioning it. As a general rule, the US has a very weak party system as compared to most other countries. In other countries, if you're part of a party, you tend to get seats, win seats or lose seats because you're part of that party. In the US, it's really tends to be a little bit more candidate driven, less party driven, and the parties don't have a lot of political power, mostly because they can't kick people out. So if someone wants to run as a Republican or a Democrat, they can, even if the party doesn't necessarily agree that they fit within their platform or they vote the same way as the party. If a candidate chooses to run under their party label, they basically can do it. So the only way the party sort of can come against it is to, again, they just generally don't fund those candidates, and then again try to have a different candidate who comes out in maybe a primary. And again, this is where you'll see some of that fighting a little bit maybe in primaries. But again, in the US, it's a weak party system because anybody can run under any political party label. So when political parties were exceptionally strong, they've historically been known as political machines and use patronage for power. Illinois is quite famous for this. Historical examples of the Chicago political machine, we still hear lots of discussion of this. Actually, it wasn't that long ago. So Mayor Richard J. Daley is known for this, having very strong, and again, even up to recently, um, Speaker Michael Madigan had very strong legislative control. In fact, he just kind of that control was sort of lost a little bit as he kind of got in a little bit of trouble in the last few years. However, basically the person who succeeded him was still part of that same sort of machine. But at the height of this political party machines, party loyalty was really tied completely to municipal services. So if residents in neighborhoods needed garbage, even like in Chicago, you wanted your garbage taken care of, you wanted maybe to get a permit for something, a business permit, basically you registered for the party that was in charge, the dominant party, and then that basically guaranteed you those services. So again, that's where you saw strong political parties. It's really kind of tied to more of maybe even a mafia style, but known as the political party machine. And I've thrown some links on here if you're curious on both Chicago as well as New York in the early 1900s as other good examples of this taking place in the U.S. All right, now we're going to shift gears and talk about interest groups. So while political parties really focus on contesting elections, interest groups focus on the policy outcomes that come from those elections. So the question's often asked, like, why do interest groups exist? How do we, even some people like, right, how do we get rid of them? How do we have a political system that doesn't have them? And sort of the sort of tongue-in-cheek answer is, well, how else are we supposed to know what government? How else is the government supposed to know what voters want, right? So basically, interest groups kind of form because there's an interest behind them, and how large the interest groups is and how many voters they can rally will determine what kind of political power they have. That's why your strongest right, the strongest voting interest group is actually the AARP, because they have they're most influential because their members represent a massive, reliable voting bloc that consistently shows up at the polls. So interest groups would work well if they are always balanced, right? So again, I like this cartoon because right, one side you have say the doctors, on the other side you have say the lawyers, and then you have the patients sort of represented by the tombstone behind it, right? So it works if everybody's interest is given, right, and everybody has an equal footing and an equal opportunity to share their witness, and it really is the mass public who's behind an interest. It doesn't work as well when it's special interests, small groups. They just happen to have the loudest voices. Again, so what the really big problem with interest groups, right, is some interests never get formed because they don't have one, either the time or the money to be able to do it. And so it favors those who generally already have access and already have an understanding of the government and how the things work. So it favors those who already have some sort of access, some sort of interest, and the means to be able to get their interest shared with government officials. Kind of based on that, it shouldn't really be surprising then that roughly 80% of all interest groups are economic groups. So they're designed to secure specific financial benefits for their members, again, like business associations, labor unions. A much smaller percentage are public advocacy groups who work for a broader social causes, right? Who work for things outside of themselves, also known as citizen types groups, with have a purposive incentive that they're, again, contributing to the overall good of everyone, not just looking out for their own benefit or their own to get their own gain. So, interest groups exert massive influence through lobbying, fundraising, litigation, and policy drafting. In fact, because interest groups hold specialized expertise, they frequently write the actual language of our bills, state bills, and even the national bills. And this often creates what's known as an iron triangle if you look at it negatively, an issue network if you see it positively, and basically it's a tight policy making loop between interest groups, legislative committees, and then the administrative agencies that enforce those laws that are passed. So again, it's a very tightly knit group. Interest groups are formed, so not just in like the elections, but they're also writing our laws, and then they're also helping influence how the legislation actually gets enforced after it's passed. All right, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do like to sort of highlight it because as it fits in kind of with this information. So traditionally, we've had our political PACs, which are known as political action committees. Political parties also help finance campaigns, and then a few people self-finance, although rarely do they actually end up winning. But then we have had interest groups really jumping into this financing of campaigns with bundling and super PACs. And again, feel free if you're interested in looking out and doing those. But they are just, again, ways that interest groups have become more influential in not just kind of what are the policy issues we're talking about and trying to get out the vote, but actually funding campaigns and really putting big money behind candidates or behind policies that they want to see passed. All right, now that we know who the actors are, how does public policy actually get made? So, at the core, public policy is what the government chooses to do or not to do to address a collective problem. So, public problems are inherently complex because people rarely agree on whether a problem even exists, what causes it, or what the best solution is. So, again, it's very difficult. They're usually very difficult to solve. If they were easy to solve, we wouldn't need the government to solve it for us. So there are three different types of policies. Redistributive, which shifts resources from the haves to the have-nots. So again, taking resources from everyone or from a certain group and giving it to others. Distributive, which benefits a specific group only. So taking it from everyone, but then only a certain group of people get the benefit of it. And then regulatory, which are designed to change behavior. All right, so the policy basically moves through five continuous stages. So the first is the agenda setting, which is identifying an issue and getting officials to acknowledge it. Then you go to policy formation, which is drafting specific proposals or legislative bills. Then policy adoption, which is formally passing the bill into law. Then policy implementation, which is administrative agencies and bureaucrats creating the operational rules and the enforcement details. So state statutes are often written very broadly, then leaving it up to the agencies to actually define what the details are. And then it goes to policy evaluation, assessing whether the policy actually worked, which then will often trigger new legislation and start the process all over again. All right, so now we're going to examine how state policies are constrained by economics. So we have both fiscal policy and monetary policy. So remember that state and local governments are strictly limited to fiscal policy, regulating through taxing and spending. Only the federal government has the power to manage monetary policy, which is controlling interest rates and the money supply. So states are very limited in how they can regulate the economic policy to only fiscal policy. All right, so that takes us to tax policy. So again, states are limited in controlling economic policy by taxing and spending only. If you look at different states, or if you've lived across different states, states choose a variety of different options within these on what they choose to do and how they choose to enforce them. So one type of tax policy is progressive policy. So this is income taxes at the federal level. So all of us deal with this to some extent. So if you have an income, the federal tax income laws are progressive, meaning the more you make, then the higher percentage of your income that you pay in your income taxes. Then there are also, I'm going to skip down to flat taxes where everyone pays the same. So this is actually for some states like Illinois, for instance, the Illinois income tax currently, they have talked about restructuring this. Illinois income tax currently, everyone pays the exact same percentage. And so it's known as a flat tax because we're all paying the same percentage of our income. Again, the percentage rate doesn't change no matter how much income you earn. And then you have above that regressive taxes, which are often known as sales taxes. And that is because, again, everyone pays the same percentage of sales tax. So people don't pay different percentages. But if you think about it, somebody who earns $1 million and goes and buys $100 worth of groceries and pays the sales tax on that versus somebody who only makes $10,000 and goes and buys $100 worth of groceries, they're paying a larger percentage of their income in taxes. So it's not a higher percentage per se. Everybody's paying the same percentage, but it's a higher percentage of their income because they earn less. And then some capital gains taxes we won't get into too much. They're still a lot of more local areas than I don't think any states have actually done this yet, other than gas taxes, consumption-based taxes, so taxing based on what you spend. Gas taxes would be one of the main ones of doing that, but there's other consumption taxes that some local governments have done. Again, capital gains taxes is on investments, and then property taxes. So based on your property values, this is usually tied very closely to local taxes. So often counties, local towns, um, things like that will often have the property taxes. And it's often tied very closely to education. So a lot of property taxes go to pay specifically education. But again, there are a variety of these across lots of different states where you see them. Again, some states choose to have more sales taxes and not to have income taxes. Similarly with property taxes, sometimes some states will have higher property taxes and rely more on that. Some states will choose to have lower property taxes. All right, so not putting a lot of time, spending a lot of time on this, but the link is in here if you want to look at it. But again, this is looking at the federal income tax, the top 1% versus the bottom 95%. So you can actually see, so despite a lot of the conversations that go on out there, the top 1% of the U.S. has actually been paying more and more in income taxes over the last few decades, and the bottom 95% is paying less and less. And that's one reason why you're seeing a lot of tax crunches in different places, because again, while you have a lot of top earners and people who are higher percentages of those, you're taking it from a smaller group of people versus a larger group of people, it does make your tax base a lot smaller. So again, just throwing these in here, we may revisit this later when we talk about state budgets. But again, if you're interested in kind of, again, there's a lot of debate on there. Do the rich pay their fair share? I believe Illinois, right? There's a few politicians talking about some of the wealth taxes and doing that. So again, kind of just highlighting that it is, out there, and you can definitely do some research and take some more look at some of the information that I'm sharing with you. Again, as you work on your states, one thing you definitely want to look at is maybe the different types of taxes that states use and how they use those. Some other statistics that might be interesting. Again, some more just pulling it in. The link is on here. So states with the highest taxes on the low income households. So again, you see a variety of states, both what you would see is conservative versus liberal, big versus small, all kind of in that same little area in there. But you can see on there kind of where those fall. Again, also just throwing a little bit different information. So income tax rates, again, they vary widely. So just throw on again a link on here and show you who the highest tax states for income taxes are and which states are the lowest for income taxes. All right, and then hopefully as you're kind of looking through all of that, just kind of to wrap it all up, so why don't all states use either progressive income taxes? And the main reason why a lot you don't see progressive income taxes at the state level as often you do even though we have it already at the federal level, is because of taxpayer mobility. So unlike federal taxation, citizens and corporations can easily move across state lines. High earners, major corporations are the most mobile. They have the most income to be able to move. And so if a state's tax burden becomes too high, business and residents relocate to lower or right to work states. We've seen this quite to an extent, and Texas and Florida, but Texas in particular has been one of the big winners over the last um, few years, as a lot of companies have moved from Illinois to Texas, and also even more recently, from California to Texas. So Caterpillar being a great example, which actually moved from Peoria, moved its headquarters to Chicago, but then ended up moving its headquarters to Texas. States so have to constantly balance raising necessary revenue for public services against the risk of driving away businesses and high earning income taxpayers. So again, I didn't mention New York, but New York is another example, and can find some resources for you guys on this that also did this. And so again, a lot of the New Yorkers moved to Florida. That's where Florida was the big winner from New York. And New York so they raised their taxes on the wealthy in their states, and then they actually had a huge shortfall in their income within their state, because again, the majority of those who are wealthy and would have been paying that higher income tax, basically just chose to leave the state. Again, Illinois is not one of the highest. We are a higher tax rate, but not, as you saw, not one of necessarily the highest ones listed. But it has been brought up to have some of these wealth taxes going, and we have already seen it not being as friendly of a business state, with a lot of companies moving. Again, Texas being one of the main recipients, and California is as well. When they're not the only three, but New York, California, and Illinois are three of the big kind of losers, and really seeing companies and wealthy individuals moving out of their states in the last few years, based on mostly on their tax policies. So again, just some things to think about and tie it all together, and how all of this fits together, and how again, from political parties, interest groups, and then policy formation, again, and then how does this all play out in our states.